From around the middle of the 19th century, there was a strong movement to apply artistic design production to sites in large industrial complexes. This trend was motivated, on the one hand, by this advent of new materials, but then on the other hand, by a desire to integrate the factory complexes into a landscape, or even in some cases into an urban site with some sensitivity. It was also developed as a trend because of the increasing importance that companies paid to the desire for a distinct image for their corporation. So architecture, beginning around the end of the 19th century and intensifying in the 20th century, began to be used for commercial purposes. Scholars largely agree that it was the turbine factory for the Allgemeine Elektrizitätsgesellschaft, or General Electric Company in Germany, whose headquarters were on a prominent urban site in Berlin, that is the seminal example of architecture entering into this commercial representation and at the same time wanting to use these new materials of steel and glass, but insisting that these materials be brought into a sort of artistic expression that would be adequate for this corporation. The architect Peter Behrens in 1907 was appointed artistic director responsible for creating an entire image system or branding package for this international company. He designed the trademark. He was responsible for all the printed matter, as well as the design, at least the aesthetic sort of styling, if not the technical design, of a full range of household appliances like fans and heaters and lamps. He was responsible for all the retail installations, and he even designed some staff clubhouses, as well as all the buildings of the factory. Now, it's important to remember that factories at this time still were not considered sort of architecture with a capital A. Factories had started to use these new materials of steel and glass, especially to span large areas where equipment could be manufactured and stored. But the factory made of glass and steel was regarded as a very perfunctory building type. It was Behrens' charge to bring that building type, that kind of industrial, functional building type, into the status of architecture as an art. Behrens was absolutely clear about his ambition to raise the factory architecture to the status of serious, profound architecture. The architecture that he desired, he himself called industrial neoclassicism. It's a kind of reduced, abstracted classicism that would be that would also be a new German architecture. This last point is important because it expresses a desire not only to represent the economic status and economic importance of the company, but it was also an understanding of the company's role as a primary force in the creation of state identity and even in social change. In order to conceptualize this representational role that this new architecture would play, which would be on the one hand representing the commercial power of these great corporations, these energy-producing corporations, but also to even participate in creating a larger national identity. In order to accomplish that, Behrens needed the help of architecture theory. The theory that he turned to first was his own version of Hegel's theory, which we've seen earlier in the beginning of this course, that has to do with the way architecture appears in history as a representation of a sort of cultural ethos, and that representational role or representational vocation of architecture has to move and change through time as culture itself changes or as history itself moves forward. For example, in Greek times, we know that the temple is the primary architectural paradigm. The temple for Behrens was the exquisite representation of the ethos of democracy, of intellectual life in the polis, in the Greek polis. Then we move into medieval times. There is the Christian church that is the dominant authority, that is the dominant power, and the architecture is the cathedral. The architectural paradigm is the cathedral that adequately represents that ethos. With the secularization in the Renaissance, but also the move in power a little bit away from the church and toward the aristocracy, then the palazzo becomes the architectural type to represent that emerging and developing aristocracy. So with this kind of Hegelian understanding of this teleological development of architecture in relation to a social ethos or a kind of cultural ethos, he looked at his own time. It was clear that in his work for the AEG, it was industrial capitalism which was the new authority. It was industrial capitalism that needed to assert itself as I say, both the power, a commercial power, but also even a cultural power in the creation of a new kind of German identity. What was then the architectural paradigm that would be adequate to this new ethos? The factory. Not just any factory, though, the turbine factory. The turbine factory which would house the construction, the manufacture of these giant steam turbines. It was the biggest kind of machine for producing electricity, for producing the power of Berlin, the power of the whole of the country of Germany. How do you represent that kind of production of power adequately in a building? For that, he turned to another theorist. The second theorist that Behrens turned to was the architect and historian Gottfried Semper. He was a practicing architect, but also an architecture theorist whose primary interest was in the very beginnings of architecture and how the beginnings of architecture could influence and help structure and conceptualize architectural practice in the present. To study those beginnings, he visited the exhibition of 1851 in London, housed by the Crystal Palace. There, in one of the exhibitions, he saw a full-scale replica of a primitive hut from the Caribbean islands. And the sort of empirical fact of this primordial shelter exhibited in what at the time was the most advanced building in the sense of new materials and industrialized production of the architectural elements, the contrast of the most advanced and the most primitive sort of prompted Semper to sort of turn to a kind of materialist but also anthropological model of architecture's beginnings and a kind of model of how architecture could move from those beginnings to the present. The way he did this was to reduce the building down to 4 elements. But each of those 4 sort of formal architectural elements. But each of those elements would also have associated with it a technique, a means of production, a certain kind of material, but also a certain technical skill that manipulates and forms that material. The first element, and he considered it first a social or cultural element, which is fire, is the beginning, he thought, of society itself. It's fire that provides both the formal centering device, but also the warmth, the protection that the group can then gather around and form itself as a tribe, as a group, as a community. But the fire needs the help of architecture. In order that the fire can be lifted up off the damp earth, lifted up into the sort of vicinity of the group gathered around the fire, another material and another form is required. Something like a bowl or a pot or a hearth that contains the fire, and that container would therefore require the technique of ceramics, or perhaps later in history, it would require the techniques of metallurgy. Now, to hold that pot, that ceramic or metal pot off the earth, some kind of base is required. And Semper theorized that the base would be made of masonry, that the technique associated with the base that raises up the hearth would be masonry. Masonry has an inherent weight, a kind of inherent attachment to the earth, because the bricks themselves are made out of the earth, but they also bear on the earth with the compressive forces. Bricks are blocks that have to be put in a row and stacked, and that cutting and stacking and the composition of solid crystalline blocks is referred to by the term stereotomy. Stereotomy in German refers to the composition made of building up with blocks, with chunks of materials. It is almost naturally monumental. It's almost naturally, it's also, it obviously deals with compression. It deals with stacking. It's naturally related to the earth because of the weight of the blocks. So stereotomy becomes a kind of automatic way of producing monumentality. But it's also associated with Zimper with this idea of a base. Now, in contrast to stereotomy, which is also has a kind of inertness, also has a kind of idea of crystalline pieces. Opposed to that is an architecture of an elastic frame. Zimper called this tectonics, and this tectonic frame becomes the third element in his typology. Zimper deviated from the classical understanding of a trabeated system where the column and the entablature of the column and the roof are two separate elements tied together at a joint. He rather theorized a kind of tectonic assembly that would rise from this masonry base where the walls and the roof together made the tectonic system. The other association or connotation of tectonic is that we're dealing with relatively small elements that can operate not so much in a compressive way, but that have tensile strength. And these individual elements would be connected by a knot or a tying together. So this is what he called the tectonic system. As the craft associated with stereotomy is masonry, the craft associated with tectonics is carpentry. So again, each part of the system has a technique associated with it. Interestingly, too, it was in the knot, the joining together of two pieces of wood with a knot, that Zimper saw the origin of architectural ornament. The joint is the origin of ornament. The final element in his system, the final typology, is then the enclosing membrane that would wrap this tectonic system of walls and roof. Interestingly, again, Zimper didn't imagine the enclosing membrane would be the same as the stereotomic system of masonry. Rather, he imagined that the enclosing membrane was a cloth or a tapestry or some sort of woven material. So the enclosing membrane, no matter how thick it was, it could be thin and porous in some climates, it could be thick and heavy and insulating in other climates, but in either case, it would be associated with weaving. The other interesting thing that Zimper added to this is that he knew that, as he had seen with the primitive hut in the Crystal Palace, he knew that these architectural elements formally would develop over time, but he also knew that materially they would develop over time. So what he theorized was, for example, if you take the woven cladding or the woven membrane, he knew that at some point that would become made of brick. But he imagined that the brick would carry some of the legacy of the weaving, and maybe the way the mason would then use the brick in a more decorative way, creating patterns, creating different textures, rather than just piling up in a straightforward way. The legacy of the decorative surface of the carpet or the mat or the cloth would continue into the masonry, into the new material of masonry. These four elements, the fire, the base, the tectonic system that rests on the base, and the cladding system or the membrane that then keeps out the wind and the rain, were Zimper's four anthropological materialist types that are the very beginning of architecture.